Welcome to the Line Life podcast. I'm Jeff Postlethwaite, Senior Editor of T&D World, and today we're bringing you more stories of the grit, courage, and inspirational teamwork that it takes to be a line worker.
Hi, this is Amy Fishbach, Field Editor for T&D World magazine and host of the Line Life podcast. Today I'm excited to bring you a bonus episode for our Line Life podcast from our new T&D World podcast, which is hosted by Christina Marsh, Nikki Chandler, and Jeff Postlethwaite. They recently released a new episode we thought would be very interesting to our Line Life podcast listeners as well. This episode features Alan Drew. I interviewed Alan years ago when I wrote a story for our Line Worker supplement about the history of line work, and he mailed me a copy of his wonderful book called The American Lineman. If you haven't checked it out yet, make sure you get a copy of it because it's a comprehensive and well-written book with lots of photos and insights about the history and tradition of the line trade. While the T&D World Line Life podcast has been focused on the line trade since we first launched it a few years ago, our brand new T&D World podcast, which also broadcasts on Fridays, was just aired a few months ago and is focused on electricity delivery professionals and the rest of our T&D World audience. This podcast has you covered from transmission to distribution and everything that affects the power grid. To listen to both the T&D World podcast and the Line Life podcast, you can look for our promos at tdworld.com/podcasts, follow T&D World on social media, and also subscribe to our e-newsletters, especially Energizing and Lineman Life, so you'll be notified when new episodes are available. You can also listen and subscribe to both the T&D World podcast and the Line Life podcast in your favorite podcasting app. Now we'll move on to today's bonus episode for the Line Life podcast, which features an interview with Christina Marsh, Senior Editor of T&D World, and Alan Drew.
Hello and welcome to the T&D World podcast. My name is Christina Marsh, and today we're joined by Alan Drew. Alan, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be here.
Alan, if you don't mind, I'm just going to have you briefly just give the folks a little bit of background information on yourself.
Okay. I started in the power delivery industry. Actually, in 1959, I went to work with Pacific Gas and Electric Company in Salinas, California, as a groundman. And then I worked my way up to truck driver, apprentice lineman, line foreman, line superintendent. And then while I was at PG&E, I went back to school in the evenings and earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering. And that opened more doors for me. And then I advanced up into some management positions with PG&E to division electric superintendent. And then from there, I had an opportunity to go to work for the Public Utility District of Clallam County in Port Angeles, Washington, as the general superintendent. So I moved up there after about 35 years with PG&E and became the general superintendent up there and stayed there for about 9 years and then moved to Boise, Idaho, where I became an instructor for Northwest Lineman College and worked there as an instructor for quite a while and then became an owner of the college and advanced there to Vice President of Research and Development, and stayed there for about 25 years. And then I kind of backed away from that and moved to St. George, Utah, where I am right now. And I still do some technical assistance with Northwest Lineman College and provide support whenever I can. But that's kind of an overview of my career. Along the way, I did several things that were fairly unique. I was one of the first employees to barehand work from a helicopter at PG&E on the 500 kV system. And then while I was at Northwest Lineman College, we decided that we wanted to give linemen more recognition. And so we did the book, The American Lineman, and I was the author of that. And then in 2008, I was inducted to the International Lineman's Hall of Fame, and did another book in 2015 called Spanning the Straits, which is a story of the historic early transmission line that came through California and had a long span over the Carquinez Straits as it fed into the Bay Area. So that's a kind of a pretty good overview of I've loved the trade, been in it for a long time, and have tried to stay with it, and still try to contribute in every way that I can.
Yes, you've had quite the career, Alan. Thanks so much for that background information. So, in today's episode, we're going to take a journey through the history of linemen and the power industry and explore how construction methods, materials, safety, and tools have evolved over the decades. So, we'll start with the telegraph era. Alan, can you give us a glimpse into the very first linemen? How did they emerge with the rise of the telegraph?
Well, the telegraph really started it all. Of course, 1846 was the very first experimental telegraph line developed by Samuel Morse that went between Baltimore, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. It was a short line, but they built it with the wire on poles. So it was the first actual line on poles that would build. And so workers had to get up the poles and handle the wires, and that's kind of where it all started. They weren't called linemen then. They had a bunch of different titles that they used, but that's actually the roots of linemen at that point. And the telegraph then, with its success, rapidly expanded. And the next big element that involved linemen was the transcontinental telegraph line of 1861. And that line went from Omaha, Nebraska to Carson City, Nevada, 1,744 miles, 45,000 poles. And linemen built that line across the West. And it really proved at that point the value of the lineman. Because once the telegraph line was completed, the mayor in San Francisco telegraphed Abraham Lincoln, giving him support for the Union. And it was really amazing when you think of what the communications was before that telegraph, where they had to actually, use the Pony Express and other means of traveling for messages. Now all of a sudden they could tap with the telegraph keys and a message could go instantly, almost like text messaging today, but a little cruder, but it was a significant improvement in communications for the country. And linemen, were a big part of that telegraph era. The next part of it that became pretty important for linemen was the Civil War. The telegraph was very important in the Civil War. It provided a strategic advantage to the North, had the majority of the telegraph lines, and they could dispatch troops, send messages, do a lot of things with the telegraph. And linemen had to actually build the lines and maintain them, and it could be dangerous. You could be, while you were up on the pole, you could be shot. And so linemen had a pretty big role. They were part of the Signal Corps at that time in maintaining and installing the telegraph for the Civil War. So the telegraph era was clearly the starting point for the linemen. And they learned to set poles all by hand and string wire and tie it in and repair lines, because the telegraph line going through the West was a lot of times would be sabotaged by the Indians, and they'd have to repair it. And of course, they were then susceptible to any sort of attacks from the Indians. But linemen clearly had a big role in the telegraph era.
Yeah, so you talked about some of those challenges faced by the Indians. What were some of the other challenges they faced in maintaining these early telegraph lines?
Well, of course, the weather, again, just like it is now, would be a challenge too. You know, you had snow, you had rain, you had winds, and so you had to obviously deal with those conditions either in installing or repairing, the telegraph lines. And another pretty big challenge for them was, as you can imagine, coming across the United States, going to the West, there weren't a lot of wood for poles, and poles had to be then transported from maybe some fair distances to the north where there were more trees available, and linemen, in some cases helped out with actually getting the poles and having to transport them quite a ways to get them on the route of the line where they were needed. So, there were a lot of challenges. Climbing the poles was obviously a challenge in those early years. And the first telegraph linemen did not have belts as we know them today, where you can hook a belt around the pole and lean back and support yourself. The first linemen just climbed with their climbers, and they learned to wrap one leg around the pole to support themselves, and climbed without a belt. So that obviously was quite hazardous too.
Right. And today we've got all of the gear and the proper tools. We've got special shoes for linemen, all of that. They didn't have that then.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so going along the timeline, it's the 1890s, and electricity is first started to being distributed. There's a major debate between AC and DC power. How did this impact linemen and system development?
Well, this was probably the biggest thing for linemen, I think, that probably ever occurred. At the time power was introduced in the late 1890s, it was obviously new to everybody. And it was a phenomenon. Lights would light, and people had never seen power before. So obviously it was really a new, very new and exciting technology. And it started to formulate into two camps. When the very first power was direct current, that was done predominantly by Edison and his companies, and so direct current was used to start with. And the first station was the Pearl Street station in New York, and it fed about a block or two of people for lighting. And they found out right away that direct current really couldn't take power too far. It had to be pretty well confined in a fairly short area from where it was generated. At about this time, other experiments were going on, and the alternating current, which was the other main version of electricity, where the current alternated between positive and minus, started to emerge, and it proved that the transformer could be used with alternating current, which would allow the voltage or pressure to be stepped up and the power to be sent greater distances. So those two systems now, both established, direct current and alternating current, started to be used predominantly in the East, a little bit in the West. And linemen then were starting to have to work on both these systems. And the Edison system, direct current, Edison people always promoted that their system was a lot safer than alternating current, that alternating current could be more deadly and hazardous to anybody touching it or working on it. So the linemen were kind of caught in the middle. They weren't sure exactly, what to do, is what was safe to work on and what was not safe to work on. The Edison people were actually demonstrating the hazard of alternating current by electrocuting dogs and other animals to show just how hazardous alternating current was. And the most famous one was Topsy the elephant, kind of a rogue elephant from the zoo, and they electrocuted Topsy, and it wasn't very pretty to see it. And there was a YouTube video on it for quite a while that could be seen. It wasn't very pretty, but linemen anyway were caught in between, understanding what was safe and what was not safe, and what were the hazards of alternating current and how to deal with them. The very first linemen worked mostly on DC systems, which was used for street lighting in the early cities. And linemen were brought up early with direct current, and then as alternating current started to take over and power lines became longer distances and transmitted larger amounts of power, then linemen started to work on alternating current. And it was very hazardous in those early eras. There weren't a lot of records kept, but some indications were that 1 out of 3 linemen were killed on the job, which is, pretty
Wow.
staggering. And the employers, interesting at that time, actually expected their linemen to take risks to get the job done. It was a totally different mindset than today's safety conscious companies. But those early days were clearly trial and error and a lot of hazards, and linemen learning the difference between alternating current and direct current.
Wow. I mean, I can't even imagine working in those standards. I mean, no safety measures at all.
Yeah, that's right. And one other instance that really describes how hazardous it was. Then there's a lot of pictures of it in New York City and in all the larger cities. They had wood poles, and on the poles were all kinds of different circuits. You had the power circuits, you had telegraph circuits, you had police circuits, you had fire alarm circuits. You had all these different wires on the poles, and they were very congested. They were all together. There were no standards or no codes to tell you how to build these to be safely. So the linemen would get up on these poles, and in many cases would be electrocuted just because there were so many wires and paths for current to flow through their bodies. So the congestion and lack of codes and standards to construct these lines in a safe manner also made it very hazardous for the linemen.
Yeah, that's a high stakes environment to be working in for sure. I can't even imagine. So in the early 20th century, we saw a significant expansion of power systems. How did interconnecting transmission lines change the role of linemen?
Well, the 20th century, as it progressed, obviously we gained a lot of experience, and the use of power then just started to really spread across the country. There were just all kinds of mechanical uses. Motors were developed, and there was just pumping that could be done. There were just all kinds of functions that had been done by hand were now being done with electricity. So the use of electricity was in high demand. And as a result, as companies built lines across the United States, they soon found that there were some advantages to connecting these lines so that they could transmit power between companies and different areas to keep the power flow reliable and expand the system. So this changed a lot for linemen. Before, in the early days, the power plant generated power, went straight on one line to a customer, and if they were going to work on the line, they just shut the power off at the power station and work on it. Now, with the interconnected systems, And the fact that people now were relying on power and didn't like having their power out. Linemen had to learn how to work on lines and bring in other power sources so they could clear a certain area and work on the line safely by feeding the customers up to both sides of where they were working. And so taking clearances on lines where they could actually work on a portion of it de-energized became a new era for linemen. And then in addition, it didn't take them long to decide that they needed to start working on lines energized. So at this point, then there was just a ton of experimentation of how to work on these lines energized using rubber gloves, kind of wooden sticks. There were all kinds of just trial and error methods that linemen and their power companies did to be able to work on these lines energized. And they were fairly successful with some of the early stuff, although there were a lot of accidents that happened, certainly. But they provided the basis for what we've got today in the various methods that we have to work on energized lines. So a lot of hazards as the system started to expand and the need for power became so great.
Yeah, a lot of trial and error to get to where we are today. And you had mentioned the introduction of rubber gloves and stuff. I feel like that's the first time that we're really starting to see some of these companies trying to be more safety conscientious.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so rural electrification was a game changer for many communities. What were some of the biggest challenges in bringing electricity to rural America?
Well, you can imagine as America moved west, and the farms started, and agriculture became so important. The farmers started to hear about electricity and what it could do, motors and things, and the way it started is the power companies that were formed pretty much were formed around the larger cities where there were customers in close and they could build their lines and have many customers for a mile of line. And that made their revenue and everything economically productive. But to provide power way out in the countries where you might build 10 miles of line and only have 3 or 4 customers on it, the big power companies would pretty much try to shy away from that. So you had the farmers saying, "Hey, we'd like to have power too," but it wasn't cost effective to get it to them. So in the 1930s, President Roosevelt, as part of his New Deal coming out of the Depression, formed the Rural Electrification Association, which provided the basis then for establishing rural electric cooperatives and funding them across the country. And once these cooperatives were established and funded, then they started expanding and building lines out to their customers. And of course, linemen were needed for that. And there were a lot of linemen that became cooperative linemen. And the linemen became the farmers' best friends because they loved to get the power and keep it on. So they would build the power out to the farms, and the ladies in the farms would experience for the first time lights and electric irons, and some of the conveniences that they had heard about now were becoming a reality. And so the linemen had a big role in building all those lines. You can imagine all the lines and how rural it was across the country. And linemen were always building lines and stringing wire, and the farmers helped them in a lot of cases. It was quite a scene to see those rural electrification cooperatives out there providing service. And I like their slogan. They were here for the customers then, and they're still here today providing service for them. So the cooperative story is a great story, and a great story for linemen for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So at what point did formal apprenticeships for linemen begin, and how did this professionalize the trade?
Yeah, probably one of the biggest elements for linemen that actually ever took place. In 1937, the Fitzgerald Act, which what it was named, was passed through the legislation which provided the fundamental basis for apprenticeship as we know it today. Apprenticeships, of course, have been around for, hundreds of years back into Europe, and it proved to be a great way to learn a trade. And so the Apprenticeship Act was passed in 1937, which then provided what we called formal apprenticeships, where, we would take individuals that wanted to be linemen and they would go through an apprenticeship for a certain period of time, learning under the direction of a journeyman lineman, and then become journeyman linemen. And of course, that's improved over the years to what we have today, and still remains the backbone of how the electric system gets its employees for linemen. And so it all started in 1937 with the Fitzgerald Act and continues on today.
So, moving along into the war years, what impact did World War II have on the power industry and linemen's work?
Yeah, it's one of the, probably, in my opinion, one of the linemen made the biggest contributions there that are not really widely recognized as they should be. If you can imagine how the World War II evolved, and America, of course, tried to stay out of the war pretty well until 1941 when Pearl Harbor happened. But before that, the European countries, Britain and Russia, were asking Americans for if they could provide, materials and weapons for the war to assist them. And so America went into a major, major construction phase of building ships, tanks, guns, all of the things that were used in the war. And this required, factories to be set up, transmission lines to be built, substations to be built, because a ton of power was needed to build all these facilities for the war effort. And linemen, were so valuable that the government wanted linemen to stay in the country so that they could build these lines for the war effort. And some of the efforts that they did building the war effort are just really significant. There was one in Idaho where they built a line to a mining community where they needed these mines for metals for the war production. And the linemen built a 70-mile line in about 3 months, a heroic effort to get that mine going so they could get materials for the war effort. So all across the country, linemen were doing all kinds of things to keep the power on. The agricultural production from the rural America was so important for the war effort to have the food, that linemen were making all kinds of efforts to supply power and keep the power flowing. So no question about it that the linemen had a major role in at home here in World War II, providing all the power, because it was actually, when you boil it down, it was America's might in their ability to produce all of these materials that actually ended up being a decisive factor to win the war. We were able to produce so many planes, ships, and guns, not only for our own army, but for our allies, that allowed us to win the war. And then linemen also provided, there were some linemen that actually became linemen were Seabees in the Pacific, and they installed communications the same way in Europe with the Signal Corps. They built communications for the war effort. They had telephone lines across the battlefields where the commanders could talk to the frontline troops. So linemen actually were in the war as well, in the CBs and the Signal Corps. So linemen can never get enough, in my opinion, enough praise for what they did for World War II.
Yeah, they played a huge role. So you said that, we're starting to see the introduction of factories and faster production rates. Were there any technological advancements or safety improvements that emerged from this era?
There were quite a bit. Probably the biggest one was I started to see quite a bit of mechanical improvement for the linemen. We started to get diggers and derrick trucks and capstans where they could rig. And so there was quite a bit of mechanized improvements, wire stringing, reels and dollies, things like that. Those were some of the biggest elements for the linemen that made their job quite a bit easier. And at the same time, there were methods that were improving with live line tools and rubber gloves and rubber protective equipment now that they could put on energized lines to make it safer for them. So there were quite a bit of things that were done in that era. It continued to move forward. And it's amazing as you look back on all of this history, there were actually a lot of the innovations that improved the lineman trade were actually promoted and done by linemen. And that still happens today. Linemen are always very innovative and fortuitive in seeing what needs to be done. And so they played a big role in a lot of the improvements that were made as the trade progressed.
So moving along into the 1960s and 70s, we see this major shift from overhead to underground systems. What were the biggest changes that linemen had to adapt to?
Yeah, that was a big change in the 70s and 60s, all of a sudden. And it was kind of interesting how it took off. The public started, kind of thinking, hey, these pole lines are kind of ugly, what about if we put them underground? And so some of the very first residential subdivisions were put underground, and they really went over well with the public. Boy, it was nice. Here were all the homes laid out, no poles, wires going to the houses. So underground right away turned out to be very popular with the general public. And so there was a pretty big move then to put all new residential subdivisions underground. And of course, this means that the cables were underground. You had to dig and trench and install transformers. And so linemen then would be doing some of the underground work. Previously to that, in the big cities, all the major part of the distribution system in the large cities was underground. It was a major underground system with conduits and networks, and they had specially trained cable splicers that worked on the underground. So that was pretty well established. But residentially, it came, the power companies said, hey, we'll just use our linemen to do this underground work in the residential area. So at first, a lot of linemen resented the underground. They said, hey, that's sissy work. I want to be up in the air doing pole work. I don't like working underground and splicing and stuff. They wanted to be in the air. So initially across the country, there was a little reticence amongst the linemen to embrace underground. But over time, of course, that kind of melted away, and it became then a standard task and knowledge for linemen to be able to do underground work, and it remains that way today. So it was kind of a change for linemen to have to do underground from overhead, but they adapted to it well, and it became part of their job that it is today.
So this era also saw another major shift, and that was women entering the trade. How did that change the industry's culture and workforce?
Yeah, that was this. The first women entered the trade, probably in the 1950s and 60s. And it was kind of interesting to understand just what happened. If a woman came into a yard uh, with a bunch of linemen, a woman came in who's going to be on the crew, it was interesting. The linemen in the yard kind of divided into two camps. Half the camp of the linemen said, "Hey, let's help her. Let's show her how she can rig. Let's make her successful." The other half of the lineman says, "Hey, if she can't cut it, she shouldn't be here. Let her do it on her own. If she can't, don't help her. If she can't cut it, she shouldn't be here." And so there was a lot of division early on amongst the linemen about whether to support women in the trade or not. So in those early years, it was really tough for the very first ladies to break into the trade. But over time, that kind of melted away, and a lot of the ladies really showed that they could do the work, and they started to become part of the crews and worked in well. And of course, as you know, today there's a lot of female linemen that are very successful, and a lot of them I know personally have gone on above being linemen to be successful in management. So the early days were pretty rough for the females coming in, and it was a physical job. They didn't make any special arrangements for them, and they had to tough it out on the crew just like the men did. And over time, everybody adjusted to females coming in, and now, of course, they're encouraged. We really encourage females to consider the trade and enter the trade, as it could be a good career for them.
So OSHA was established in 1971, which introduced new safety standards. What was the initial reaction from linemen and utilities?
Well, prior to OSHA being established, there were a few states that did have some safety rules that line crews had to follow. And so there was some regulation by certain states. In other states, there wasn't. The National Electric Safety Code had been established, and it had some work rules in it, but not every state adopted those work rules. Some power companies had their own safety rules and their own safety rule books based on experience they had. And so linemen would, pretty much follow those. But overall, there was kind of a wide range of regulations and rules and procedures for linemen to follow. So it would be different if a lineman went from one company to another. It could be a whole lot different. He'd have to learn different rules and different ways of doing things. When OSHA came along, of course, they tried to standardize things across the country. And initially, some of the power companies were a little resentful to OSHA and the linemen that, they didn't know really what they were doing. And over time, though, OSHA developed some good rules and better relationships with the company. And, there's just no question that over time, OSHA had a big impact in improving the safety of the trade, for sure. Rules were established, and there were various training sessions set up, and things now are fairly, OSHA rules apply across the country, so linemen can work in different places and different companies, but the OSHA rules apply at all. So overall, while with anything new, there was a little bit of getting used to and adjustments. OSHA became the standard and is well accepted in the industry today.
Sure, and I'm sure that OSHA brought, a lot of stability to just the daily work and training of these linemen.
Oh, for sure. No question about that. And I think OSHA, was definitely, a huge improvement for safety alignment and for other trades as well.
hmm Okay, so moving into the digital age, technology has transformed the industry with smart grids, digital meters, and automation. How has this changed the role of linemen?
Well, um, fortunately, linemen have adapted pretty well. I always use the term when smart grid came out that, yeah, we got smart grid, but we also got smart linemen. A lot of the linemen during this era had grown up younger with some of the digital, devices like phones and pads and things. And so they were pretty adept at handling digital equipment, and they related to it pretty well. All of a sudden, with all this digital equipment, there was just a whole lot of additional information that was readily available to the linemen, whether it was their construction standards or their job packages. They had a lot of information mapping readily available to them. And then when trouble occurred, all the smart devices were able to give them information about the faults and where they were, how severe they were. And so they were a whole lot of information that was readily available to linemen. And of course, that's just growing like crazy today. But, at the same time, it was a digital age. Still, the lineman had to retain the basic skills of climbing and working on poles and doing the work by hand. The other big thing we didn't talk about that came back in the 50s, probably the single biggest element that affected linemen was the introduction of the aerial lift. That started back in the 50s where, there were way before then, there were all kinds of platforms that were used by various line companies for different types of things like maintaining street lights and railroad catenary systems. But once the bucket truck started to come out, it became an insulated bucket truck. That massively changed the work for linemen. They now could position themselves much more efficiently and safely to reach and do things. And so the bucket truck made a huge change for line workers. But getting into the digital age, again, the linemen today have a lot more information that's available to them. It's easily available to them now. And they're getting, a lot of inspection data from drones and all of the other things that are going on. But linemen have adapted pretty well to the digital age. They they've grown up with it pretty well. They've adapted well with it. And like I say, smart grid, we got smart linemen for sure.
Absolutely. What skills do modern linemen need that previous generations didn't?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of skills that are important. Some of the linemen are doing much more live line work than before. So there's no question that their skills in the live line area have to be a lot greater than they were years ago. They have to be able to handle all of the various live line work tasks that come along. So that's one area. They also have to do a lot more underground work and operate, in some cases, various instruments that are used to find faults and do other things. So, they're operating more technical equipment now than they used to do. And the other thing that I think that they're doing quite a bit differently, some linemen are actually that I've talked to are actually splicing fiber optics. The communications industry and the lineman power industry have gotten closer together because fiber optics have become such a part of the communications system, and communications is such a part of the power system that some linemen are actually developing the skill to splice and work on fiber optic systems. So while linemen still have the same skills, need the same skills of climbing and stringing wire, setting poles, and doing underground, a lot of the other peripheral things, such as dealing with energy storage systems and all of the distributed energy resources that are on the edge of the grid, linemen now have to have the skills and abilities to recognize all of those resources that are at the edge of the grid and be able to take precautions and know how to deal with them too. So the system has definitely become more complex, and there's a lot of more sources of power all around the grid that linemen have to be aware of now.
Absolutely. So, looking ahead, where do you see the industry going in the next 10 to 20 years?
Well, there's a couple of things I think will be somewhat different. First of all, there'll be a lot more underground. There's going to be a big push to put more overhead lines underground and build new lines underground. Obviously, all the fires and things that we've seen, the catastrophes, are driving, putting more underground. So linemen will be doing more underground work, in my opinion, in the next 10 years, 20 years. The other thing that I think you'll see is we'll see more direct current being done in the next 10 to 20 years. We'll see more direct current transmission lines being built to get some of this renewable energy to where it's needed. So linemen will be working maybe more on direct current. And the other thing I think will be pretty big in the next 10 to 20 years is there'll be a lot of replacement of conductors on some of the important transmission lines with the new more temperature smart conductors that have the ability to carry more capacity. And so instead of having to build a new line, they can reconductor existing lines and get more power through them. So I think linemen will be doing a lot more reconductoring of lines than they've done in the past. There has been some discussion whether there'll be more of a trend to specialize linemen in underground because there's going to be so much more underground, so that there'll be some companies may specialize and have more specific underground departments with linemen just dedicated to underground. Now, I don't know whether that'll happen. It may prove practical for certain power companies, but there's certainly going to be a whole lot more undergrounding that will be done in the next 10 to 20 years.
So, before we wrap up here, Alan, with your decades of experience, what advice would you give to young people considering a career as a lineman?
Well, I think, first of all, you couldn't pick a better profession to enter than the lineman trade right now. I mean, there's just so many opportunities to do so many things, and the companies have got such great apprentice programs now. There are line schools where you could start, like Northwest Lineman College, where you can actually get your basic training that allows you then to be successful in an apprenticeship and go on out into the trade. So I think I would certainly recommend that anybody that likes to work outdoors to start with and likes the challenges maybe of working with other people in groups to consider the line trade because of the potential. There's so much potential to go beyond that. We have so many successful linemen that have moved on beyond linemen. There's lots of upward mobility to go on and have really a long and successful career. So I think to be successful in the trade, you have to be pretty much dedicated to it, and self-improvement is probably the biggest thing that I've seen that has made individuals successful. There's so much to learn, and we have so many resources to learn now. T&D World, for example, if they can get tied in with the T&D World publications and newsletters, there's just all kinds of information about the trade and what they can learn. And the internet is just full of information. So self-improvement is what I always stress with the younger employees and students as they come up. Be highly committed to self-improvement and learning more than you can, work all the overtime you can, learn all the skills you can. It's really a great trade, and you're well compensated for it now. It's become a lot safer than it has in the past, and it's just a great trade for anybody that wants to work outdoors. And I always encourage them, if they have friends that are in the trade, to talk with them. They'll tell you about it, and that's a good way to learn more about it.
That's great advice, Alan. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you who are listening to today's episode and who are interested in more episodes like this, please go and check out T&D World Line Life podcast. That podcast airs every Friday, and it covers everything and anything line work. You can find that on Podbean or your favorite podcasting app.
This episode of the Line Life podcast was written, recorded, and edited by Amy Fishbach. It was produced by Jeff Postlewaite. That's me. To listen to past episodes, visit www.tdworld.com/podcasts or find us at Podbean. You could also drop us a voice memo or message at linelifepodcast@gmail.com with your comments on this episode. We'd love to hear from you. Please follow this show on Podbean or your favorite podcasting app to be updated when new episodes are released. Thank you for listening.